Dr. Johnson, classmates, and everyone under the sound of my voice. Thank you for listening to me this morning. If any of you watched President Obama's recent commencement address at Howard University on May 7th, then you would have heard him discuss voting in America and the African American community, and why it is important to vote. He discussed how it was important to vote all of the time. He also spoke about how only 36% of Americans showed up to vote in the midterm elections, the second lowest participation rate on record. Obama said that youth turnout was less than 20%, and in 2012, 2/3 of African Americans turned out to vote. In 2014, less than 40% of African Americans turned out to vote. One of the things that the president also pointed out is that presently people do not have to die for the right to vote, and that it is not a hard process to register or to vote in the primary or other elections. Because of all of the data that I have presented to you, I would like to discuss my point of why voting should be mandatory to all Americans, and better than our current voluntary method. Voting should be mandatory because of all of the sacrifices that people have made for all Americans to have the right today, because every American needs to make sure that their voice is heard in presidential elections, primaries, gubernatorial elections, and others, because of all of the barriers that currently hold some Americans back from voting today, and because of how government is in other countries. Before I explain my points, I would like to present some facts to you. If you don't know, the voting age in America is 18. As many of you also probably know from your history classes, women earned the right to vote in 1920, and although African Americans were technically given the right to vote in the 1800s, they faced literary tests and barriers like the grandfather clause that said if their grandfather could not vote, then they could not, which for African Americans was definitely a roadblock preventing their right as citizens. African Americans really did not earn the right to vote until 1965. A lot of barriers try to hold Americans, especially minorities, back from voting, so voting should just be mandatory for everyone. For example, in North Carolina, a new rule is that some people have to show their IDs to vote, which some call a way to make sure that certain minorities do not vote. There is also a limit on early voting across America. Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Wisconsin passed laws last year reducing early voting, knowing that African Americans are twice as likely as whites to cast early ballots. Other states that have hindered voting are Texas and Florida. Voter registration drives have ceased in the southern states. Laws have been passed to make people show proof of citizenship to register to vote. Some states try to stop previously convicted felons from voting, and a method to try to purge purported non-citizens from the voter rolls using flawed lists by matching voter rolls against motor vehicle lists, even though citizenship documentation is not required to get a driver's license, has been proposed. Voting should be mandatory because of how government is in other countries. In certain countries like Saudi Arabia, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, and others, voting is either very limited, certain groups cannot vote, or voting is not allowed at all. America is a democratic republic where people can literally choose someone who represents them on certain issues. Studies show that differences in turnout have real consequences of how well represented young, poor, or minority Americans are in government. Some people across the world do not just have the right to vote, they also do not have the kind of democracy that America does, and they do not have the same rights. So I believe that a way to honor those people is by going out and letting your voice be heard. For example, President Obama has a 52% approval rating, and in his commencement speech, he talked about how because people did not show up to the polls in 2014, he has to deal with a predominantly Republican Congress who does not support him on issues that most Americans believe in. Issues such as gun control, immigration, benefits for homeless veterans, the Fair Pay Act, healthcare for 9/11 first responders, raising the minimum wage, and free community college are issues that most Americans agree with President Obama on. No matter what certain people's beliefs are, people should respect their fellow Americans' beliefs and support mandatory voting. And although voting should be mandatory, people should not receive fines if they do not make it out. I believe that certain boards of elections all over the country should make it easier for people to vote by offering them free transportation. When people give reasons on why voting should not be mandatory, they say it is because forcing a person to vote is involuntary servitude. However, voting is a duty that all Americans should participate in. And because of how hard suffragists fought for rights that all Americans have today, such as voting, one of the best ways to honor their work is by voting. People consider standing up for the pledge and supporting our military as ways to honor our soldiers, and showing up to the polls is a way to honor previous American sacrifices. Another reason that people give for why voting should not be mandatory is because people have a right to vote just like people have a right not to vote. However, there are very few people, if any, in this country who do not care about the issues that go on in this country. For example, gun control, whether or not women have paid leave, criminal justice, wars. Voting is a way that people can choose who represents Americans on those issues. And making sure your voice is heard should be something that everyone cares about. Voting should be mandatory. People who oppose mandatory voting also say that Americans are not smart enough to vote on issues such as foreign policy. However, people have a right to their opinions, as the First Amendment of free speech showed, and just because people do not agree with someone's vote or speech does not mean they should be prevented from speaking it. People also say that voting should not be mandatory because mandatory voting forces people. There are many things that happen in life without people having a say in it, but a person should want a say in the issues that affect their everyday lives. It is also important to point out that voting is not a burden or a disadvantage, but an advantage and a fortune. Another argument is that this country was built off of freedom, which is an argument that one could question since certain people were not free to vote at one point. I believe that the freedom to vote should be mandatory. Therefore, voting should be mandatory because of all of the sacrifices that people have made for all Americans to have the right today, because every American needs to make sure that their voice is heard in presidential elections, primaries, gubernatorial elections, and others, because of all of the barriers that currently hold some Americans back from voting today, and because of how government is in other countries. Since it is not currently, the way that you all can help the cause is by convincing all of your friends to vote because of reasons that I have mentioned, and by helping people get registered and get to their polling places. Thank you for listening.